Hello, everyone. Welcome. And we have with us today Gabrielle Salfati, who is a professor of psychology and the director of investigative psychology research unit at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. But she's not going to talk about investigative psychology with us today. She is going to talk about her positive psychology. Her over 25 years career to date has been focused on serving law enforcement and mental health practitioners in a variety of ways. But her work in the field of positive psychology focuses on the development of resilience training and burnout, compassion, fatigue, PTSD, and suicide prevention for law enforcement, first responders, mental health professionals, as well as academics, teachers, students, and many other groups. She also leads major research projects on the evaluation of resilience training programs to support wellness and prevent burnout in law enforcement, first responders, and mental health professionals. So resilience is really what we're going to talk about today. Thank you, Gabrielle, for being here with us.
Thank you so much.
And thanks for agreeing to do this interview with me. So can we start with you giving a little bit of a brief overview of what is meant by resilience? Because a lot of people probably don't really know what that means in the context of what you do today.
Absolutely. So let me even take it back one step further in terms of resilience, where it is in psychology. So resilience, the definition of resilience is a skill that we have to be able to deal with adversity. So the idea is that we can't stop what happens to us in life, but we do have control about how we deal with it. So resilience is how we deal with adversity so that it has less of a negative impact on us and we bounce back quicker and better with less negative effects. Now, resilience as a concept actually sits within the body of positive psychology. And just to sort of give everybody a little bit of a background, what the difference is, or what positive psychology actually is, but also how it's different from other things that we tend to deal with in forensic psychology. So we're all used to talking about mental illness in forensic psychology and treatment. And so when we're talking about clinical psychology and treatment, we're really talking about prescriptive science. We see an illness and we prescribe a treatment in order to get people back to functioning, a state of functioning. And we refer to this as the treatment paradigm. Now, positive psychology, think of that as an add-on piece or even a separate piece from clinical psychology. We are not looking at illness per se. We don't aim to identify something that is wrong with people. We really focus on what's right with people. So instead of trying to get people from illness to functioning, we take people who are mostly functioning, even though obviously we also deal with people who are not. But the general idea is we take people from functioning to flourishing. And so we try to identify what people have that works well in life. And then we use those qualities to make it even better, to really allow people to connect with their lives, live their meaning and purpose, and flourish fully. And so resilience sits in the body of positive psychology research, and we use those qualities, this whole idea that let's approach life in a way that is about positivity in general in terms of making it functioning. It's not a happyology, but it is very much about looking at the positive and looking at when we have a situation, even if it's a negative one, like when we have an adversity. The idea is that can we deal with it in a way where we bounce back better, and sometimes we even learn from it and actually grow from it. So that's sort of what resilience is and how it sits in the larger body of positive psychology.
So wouldn't you expect law enforcement to kind of naturally be more resilient, either through original selection procedures or because they would get used to it, to the high levels of stress and dealing with it, and kind of know how to toughen it up or deal with it, you know, in their usual ways?
Absolutely. I mean, that's kind of the big issue, because We know that about 2/3 of the American workforce in general, overall, are reporting feelings of extreme stress and burnout. So we already have a situation where we've identified the workplace as one of the most stressful factors in people's lives. Now, if you take policing, obviously what they have to deal with every day is extremely stressful. They're dealing with trauma every day. They're dealing with, pressures from all kinds of angles, incredible work hours, and danger. So these are, in terms of just human functioning and the situation, this is a very difficult situation to deal with. But the thing is, police officers sign up for this. And so they know this is coming. And when they originally come into the academy, they do have a whole series of assessments that makes sure that they have a really good basic functioning level of mental health. But what we're seeing is when they come in, everything is fine. But what happens within a few years is that they're starting to demonstrate an enormous amount of stress. And that stress is over and beyond what we see in the general population, much, much higher. And even though that is higher, it would actually be even higher because if you think about it, they're starting from a much better place than most people because they're starting really healthy. We're seeing things like 78% of police officers actually, in a recent survey in 2008, actually showed us that they experience extreme stress on the job, and 70% of them within a few years actually have physical health problems that are that are caused by stress. And another study showed us that 35% of police officers, either in active duty or retired, actually show elements of PTSD. And so there's something that is happening with the jobs that they're doing that is causing a huge amount of stress. But what is really worrying is that what you have is very healthy people going into this job, and then we're still seeing this. And so one of the things that we're looking at is, where is that coming from? Why is it happening? And how is this having an impact on policing? And what can we as psychologists do to support police and law enforcement as a whole to deal with this issue?
Mm-hmm. So how do you train people to be more resilient? What does this training entail specifically? Can you just give us a little bit more detail on that?
Sure. So resilience, you can sort of summarize it into 4 different aspects. We have 4 different types of resilience that we teach people on. The first one is mental resilience. So here what we sort of train people on is, how do we look at the world and how do we deal with situations? This is really the basis of resilience, is the idea that we can't change what happens to us, but we can change the way that we interpret it. So we call this mindset, and there are all kinds of different techniques and different ways, and based on all of this is obviously based on evidence in psychology and research in psychology. But by training people how to approach situations of adversity with a particular mindset, it allows people to reframe the situation. So something that most people, when they will approach it, will maybe knock them off their feet because it is terrible and they'll get stuck. It's about being able to reframe it, not catastrophize, be able to see it maybe as something that you actually have the ability to deal with versus not. So that's the first thing. So that's mental resilience. The second thing that we look at is emotional resilience. Here, what we're really focusing on is a person's, if you want, emotional intelligence and the way that they relate to people. So a lot of what gets people into a negative situation in terms of adversity is that they can't regulate their emotions. So we're still dealing, our brain deals with a situation by instinct, call this the lizard brain. And you feel there's a fight or flight response straight away. And you feel it in your body and it floods you with hormones and with all kinds of things, and your brain starts firing and you can't react appropriately. So you react highly emotionally. But a lot of the time, this is not going to serve you. So one of the things that we train people on is how to regulate that emotion, understand how to approach a situation from a less emotional basis. Because if we can bring down that emotional level, then what we're doing is we're allowing blood to come back into the brain and people can think more logically about how to act to it. And then the third thing that we focus on is the physical, what we call physical resilience. So this is really everything to do with the body. So this is, you know, exercise, teaching people how to breathe. We do this through meditation. We look at sleep. Sleep is huge in terms of being able to regulate your emotions. And then we also look at nutrition. Nutrition, we know, is our second brain. And actually, a lot of our brain function comes from our stomachs in terms of what we put into our body. So here, what we're looking at is sort of making people aware of the influence of the body on the mind, and then tradition, and reversely the mind on the body. And so we teach them those kinds of skills. Again, the idea is about, for lack of a better word, is really putting people back into control and mastering their own emotions, their own mindset, their own bodies to deal with stress. And then the fourth one, and I think really this is the foundational, for me anyway, in terms of when we deal with law enforcement, and that is the social or the spiritual part of resilience. And what this is about is really engaging people into their meaning and purpose and what their strengths are, and their connections with the community. And a lot of people going into law enforcement, they're going to because they want to do good in the world. And we know from the burnout literature is that when you burn out, that's like the extreme end of stress. When we're there, what happens is that we disconnect. We're there because we're disconnected to our meaning and purpose and what we set out to do, our vocation. And so that's when people start getting very stressed. When people get very stressed, they get ill. If we can re-engage them into what it is that they're doing and why they're in the job in the first place, we actually provide them with the foundations for resilience. And so we build these 4 factors in, and our training programs really are based on these 4 things. And then different training programs out there in general, you know, they'll focus on 1 of the 4, 2 of the 4, but we actually focus on all 4 because together it makes people a lot stronger.
Is this a step-by-step program, or do you work on the 4 all together kind of simultaneously?
So, so let me come back to the whole, you know, where resilience and positive psychology sits compared to things like clinical. So clinical is a prescriptive science. You know, we see something, there's something wrong, we prescribe a treatment. Now, positive psychology is not prescriptive. We are not dealing with identifying something that is wrong with people. What we're really doing is teaching people tools. And it's what we call it a descriptive science. So we describe all kinds of different things. So just like the 4 things I've just described now, we describe those. And then we say to people, use what you need right now. And so we teach, so, you know, we can teach them in different orders. I teach them in a particular order because I do think that, you know, by understanding them in a particular order, you're kind of building on the skills. But we build them probably, I would say, in the order that I just presented them. So we start with mental, going to emotional, and then we start talking about meaning and purpose, and then adding all of that into the physical. But when you're using them, you literally pick and choose whatever is useful to you at that particular time, because different adversities ask for different tools. And that's the thing. A lot of people think that we're born resilient. You know, we either have an optimistic state of mind or we're a pessimist, but that's not actually true. This is a teachable and a skill set that you can learn. We know that there's actually research that's been done that shows that about 50% of our happiness or our well-being is based on, yes, genetics. It's what, you know, some people are just born happier and more able to deal with adversity than others. Only about 10% is based on our situation. So this is, I mean, if you take away, you know, basic poverty and all of that, but only 10% are based on things like how much money we have, our level of education, the kind of job that we have, whether we're in a relationship. So it's actually a very, very small percent. But 40% approximately of our ability to feel happiness and feel flourishing and well-being is based in what we think, what we feel, and what we do. And we know that people who demonstrate resilience are able to master those 3, and that's basically the basis of a resilience, because that's your mental, your emotional, and your physical and spiritual kind of resilience. So yes.
So in addition to helping the general mental well-being of the officers that you train, what are some of the other effects, direct or indirect, that this training could have on the officer's job performance and maybe even their life outside of the job?
A lot. So, I mean, when we look at resilience training in general, right? So this is when we just train people on resilience. So from the psychological literature, we know that being resilient, i.e. being able, so being taught the skills of dealing with adversity using these resilience tools actually correlates with self-efficacy. So what we mean by that is your ability to control, feel that you have control over your own life, which is huge in terms of being able to deal with adversity, that you actually feel that you have those skills. We know correlates with problem solving, emotional regulation, optimism, coping, creativity, flexibility, stress management. It actually even promotes neural structural connectivity. What we mean by that is that it actually changes your brain. So the more that we engage in something, it actually changes your brain structure so that the next time you're meeting with that adversity, it actually helps you deal with the situation. So it actually physically changes your brain by engaging in these different actions, which is a fascinating new angle in this in terms of neuroscience. We also know that resilience training decreases depression, stress, anxiety, and we know that in general, resilient people do better in almost every single aspect of their life, be it at work, their personal lives, their health. They all kind of flow into one another. We also know that if you receive training, let's say in your workplace, that this actually also improves your mental health, your well-being, your psychological functioning, your performance in general at work, and it actually also reduces compassion fatigue. Now, all of this is all evidence-based based on, numerous studies in psychology, but then there's a small number of studies, we don't have a lot yet, but in terms of when we look at resilience training in law enforcement, and what we see here is that law enforcement who go through resilience training actually display lower levels of stress, improved physiological and psychological health outcomes. We see improved organizational outcomes in terms of how they relate to their organizations and their co-workers. They perform more efficiently during critical incidents, which is huge, because critical incidents, obviously, the way that you look at them in terms of your mindset and how it affects your emotions, we're seeing a lot there. So having the resilience training helps you in those situations. There are recent studies that shows that law enforcement officers who received resilience training actually had about a 40% improvement in mental stress, 25% improvement in emotional vitality, and almost 25% improvement in physical stress. Now, these aren't studies that I've done. This is just the general literature in resilience. So it has a huge impact in terms of the numbers. So this is the literature. But I think that the thing that I would say is the biggest is that allowing people to have these tools proactively. So instead of going in and saying to people, once they're ill and they need then to be sent to a psychologist, we take away their badge, their gun, they go into treatment program. Before even getting there, if we say to people, as part of your basic training, we're going to give you cool tools, just like, learning how to handle a gun, how to interact with people, how to, whatever, all of those other tools that we do in policing. If you give that as a basic proactive tool as part of the training at the very beginning, what you're doing is that you are giving people those skills that they can use. And so they feel more able to do their jobs. And I think that is a huge thing that we can do for law enforcement.
So you've talked a little bit about how you measure, how you know that this training works. Would you say that this measure of success of the training is the same or different for you as a psychologist, from your psychological and scientific perspective, and the perspective of the officers on the job?
In terms of
they kind of see the success, whether or not the training actually worked for them. How do they know that it worked?
Right. So I think that during the training, when people receive this, obviously, they're seeing the actual tools themselves. I think the key thing, and I think this goes for everybody, including law enforcement, is the fact that you feel more in control because you're learning that it's a teachable skill set. It's something that you can acquire. So even if you feel that you don't have these tools, it puts you back in the driving seat of your own emotions and your own mind. Obviously, when we train law enforcement, we're putting this within all of these resilience tools within the context of law enforcement. And so we're picking and choosing the things that will be more of an issue for law enforcement. But generally, we're all human beings. So, resilience is the same. Now, in terms of how they're taking it away, we're actually just doing a study on that right now. Where we are, so they're going through a resilience training program that is organized by their own law enforcement agency. And I'm coming in, and so I'm collaborating with them. And that exact thing is what we're measuring. We're trying to find out how this resilience training is perceived by law enforcement. So what we do is we're going in, even before they receive the training, we're asking them basic questions about their mental health. We're actually measuring their, what is their level of resilience? What do we know about the type of resilience that they're already engaging in? We measure, what level of compassion fatigue do they have right now? So that's the kind of the tiredness they get from seeing a lot of trauma every day. We ask them about stress. We ask them about burnout. We ask them about organizational issues, a whole host of things. And then we also ask them about their general well-being before they receive the training. Then they go through a training program. And then immediately after they finish the training program, we measure their resilience level again to see if there is an immediate impact on their resilience. And then we ask them, qualitative questions, what did you take away with you? Was it useful? What did you learn? How, basically, what did they feel about the training? So we get kind of an idea about what they're taking away with them. And then we follow up with them 6 months later to see, did they use these skills and how did that work out for them? And so it's like a longitudinal study. So this is the study that we do, but having sat in on that training that they get, I saw them in action when they were receiving this. And it was an incredible experience because they're sharing all of these different adversities that they're all engaging in, but not just at work, but at home and in their lives in general. And I think the biggest thing with resilience and positive psychology is we have the saying in positive psychology that if we had to, it was actually Peterson, who's one of the founders of positive psychology. And when he was asked, how, if you had to boil down positive psychology to one thing, what would it be? And he said, other people matter. He says it's the relationship we form with people that allow us to have the foundations for well-being and resilience. And so by putting people in a room together, dealing with these concepts at the same time, you're not just delivering information and training them, you're allowing them to connect as a community. And that is huge. And community is already a very big thing in policing because they need that in order to, that they're really, it is like a family in policing. And that sort of strengthens that. And I think that's part of the resilience training is actually getting people together, giving them a common vocabulary, a common set of experiences, realizing that you're not out of the norm. It isn't such a big stigma as what people are saying or feeling, that other people are experiencing what you are. And there's nothing we human beings like more than feeling connected to other human beings. That's level 4 of the resilience training. That's that whole social aspect of it. Because stigma is a huge thing in terms of mental health and policing.
So we are right now in the midst of pandemic and lockdowns and quarantine. So what are some of the current challenges of doing this training in the midst of the pandemic, and how did that affect your work with the law enforcement?
Yes, that's an interesting one. So we started doing research on resilience training because even before the pandemic, the last few years, we've had a mental health crisis in law enforcement that's been really highlighted as a very, very big issue. So just to contextualize that, last year, so in 2019, there were 228 suicides by law enforcement officers. That's twice as many as law enforcement officers that died in the line of duty. So law enforcement officers are taking their lives more often than being killed by others. That really puts us in the context of what was happening in law enforcement. And so one of the things that we were looking at before the pandemic even started is, what can we do to support law enforcement, and what are some of the issues that are happening? And some of the issues that were causing this were, to do with obviously the compassion fatigue, the stress, the PTSD, the depression, all of that. But it was also organizational in terms of the pressures that law enforcement are under whilst doing their jobs, the lack of sleep, and a whole host of things. So we started this research looking at that. When we actually put the research in place, it was interesting because the first cohort that we put through the resilience training and then did the measurements on the train back from that training, I got the message from the college saying, we're closing down because of COVID. So it literally happened the day after. And so then the pandemic struck. And here was what the interesting thing was, because for the first, even though the pandemic was, or still is, a huge change for the way that we live life. For first responders, obviously, it was a two-edged sword, because they were put again in a situation of an increasing amount of fear and stress in terms of, wearing the PPE, being in situations where they're called out. They're on the streets. They weren't able to just stay at home and isolate. They were on the streets. They were first responders. And so they were scared that, they were bringing these diseases home to their families at the end of the day, that they were more likely to catch. And we saw a very large proportion of these cases actually being within first responders. But at the same time, the pandemic also brought this connection to your job, because for the first few months of the pandemic, first responders and frontline workers were hailed as our heroes. They were there and taking care of us. And so law enforcement were going into these jobs. This is their meaning and purpose. Then you also have that aspect. And so we expected to, so it was an interesting thing, which one weighs out more? The fact that you were useful again, the fact that people feel that you're contributing and that you're a hero, or the fear of the pandemic. And so this is when we're looking at, in terms of resilience and in terms of meaning and purpose, which one weighed out more? So we're still waiting for those results. I actually have a meeting this afternoon where we're looking at what some of these things that happened. And then on the tail end of that, as soon as, after they were hailed heroes for a few months, we then had the protests and the riots, which much of it was anti-law enforcement in nature. And then we had the whole situation of defunding. So now again, we're having the negative side that is affecting law enforcement in terms of, there are issues, but this is not the majority of law enforcement. So many of them are saying, but I have spent my whole career helping people, and now I'm being hated for it. And so there's that juxtaposition again about what your job means to you. And that's the biggest thing that gets people into a state of stress. So I think that it's going to be interesting to see how this impacts law enforcement. But what we're also very interested to see is, now that they've received the resilience training, how is that impacting them? Were they able to deal with this in a way where that adversity, be it the pandemic, be it the riots, the protests, the defunding, all of those things, did they now have the skills to deal with that in a way where they were able to wear that raincoat in the rain, so to speak, which is always the example I use when I talk about resilience. It's like resilience is like wearing a raincoat in the rain, so that it's not that you don't feel the adversity, but you bounce back more quickly and with less negative effect. So the jury's out right now. We're hoping to see what those results are going to show us.
So it sounds like this raincoat would be really useful for law enforcement everywhere across the board. So do you think this kind of training should be standard procedure across agencies, and what would it take to have that actually happen in the United States here?
So I think that there's definitely a movement towards that. So resilience has become a big word, and mental health, because it was even bigger, it's been highlighted as a thing that we really need in law enforcement as a basic skill and a tool that we give our law enforcement to protect them. And the more we protect them, the more they're able to protect the public, because they're healthy. And so there has been a movement definitely to try to integrate this more into law enforcement. Now, whether it should be standardized or not, there are different elements of it, and I think different agencies are sort of training people on different aspects of it, depending on what resources they have, who their force is, and who's training them as well. Now, what we don't know right now is the impact of that and the sort of things that are going to have the most impact. There was actually a study that was done, a review that was done, I think it was last year, where someone sent out a survey looking at what kind of programs do we actually have in law enforcement right now and how are they working. What they found is that a lot of agencies did have things like psychologists and being able to deal with mental health once people are in crisis. But only, I think it was 39% of agencies, I think there's almost 500 agencies that were surveyed. Only about 39% of them had some kind of resilience program. So the minority, and that was, I think, the second to smallest type of program that was delivered in law enforcement. So what we're seeing is we know resilience is key, but not a lot of agencies have it yet. But we know that it's something that is on the cards. We have the International Association of Chiefs of Police, which is the agency that sort of guides policing internationally in terms of what is important for chiefs to do within their organizations. They actually have a wellness conference where they highlighted resilience as being a huge thing because of this suicide crisis that we have in law enforcement. So people are definitely going in that direction. We see it more in terms of the funding agencies that we have that highlight what we need to do in policing. They're highlighting well-being as well as a top thing. But what we don't have a lot of right now is the research that shows us what the impact of resilience training is and what specifically it is that is important. And I think it's really important for us to do that research so that we can really pick out the things that have the most impact. So what we call evidence-based practice, right? So we base everything on the science so that when we create these training programs, we do it on the things that we know are going to have an impact on our law enforcement officers. So that's where we're at right now. And we're, I'm doing a review of everything that people are doing out there in terms of the psychological literature on resilience and the law enforcement literature on resilience, and then also actual resilience programs. And we're trying to get a sense of what do we know right now, what works, and what are the questions that we still have to make it even better. And that's kind of the next step in where we're going with this. So the question, to answer your question, yes, we do need this. Yes, we should definitely put this in place. It is already happening, but what we need to make sure is that we don't just put it in place. We need to put it in place, making sure that we put the right things in place so that we serve our law enforcement officers to the best capacity, because that's our responsibility as scientists.
Thank you. So you kind of answered a little bit my my next question already in terms of what do we not yet know about this training and how, like, what are the research questions that you are currently working on? What are your questions in this area generally? So if you can go just into a little bit more detail on that, that would be great.
Mm-hmm. There's a whole host of questions that I have that I would love to know more, because it's always the questions that we ask is always going to inform the answers that we get and how we move science forwards. And science is always about asking questions. Even when we have things in place, we still ask questions. Right now, we're at the very beginning of putting this in place. And I think that more than ever, when you start something, that is when you really need to ask the really good questions to build a foundation for having something good to move forward. One of my biggest questions right now is the impact of training itself. So when people are going through training, what is the impact and why? Once people get trained, when they go out into the world and meet with various adversities, be they at work, at home, or any other area of their lives, do they use these resilience tools? And how, and what are their experiences? So this is sort of in terms of how, the training aspect. I also have questions about what's the best way for us to deliver this training. So a lot of, a lot of training is, it's about, you train people on content, but do we train people on how to apply this content? And even the people who train law enforcement officers, how do we train them to deliver this training the best? Because they're not necessarily the psychologists, they're the trainers within the academies. So it's our responsibility to sort of develop train the trainer models that really have an impact. So those are some on the training side, but I think that there's some even bigger questions. Before we even get to that, I think that what we're missing right now are the baseline questions in terms of what's the situation that we're in right now. Before we can even build a program, before we can ask questions, we need to know what is our situation. We have a few figures here and there, but they're not very big and they're not based on big studies. We don't have a good sense of what are the numbers of, what kind of resilience do police officers have when they go into the academy? Are this part of selection programs? What are they particularly, what is it that makes a police officer successful in dealing with adversity versus not? And in terms, and how does that, then go over into the training? What kind of, that informs us what kind of resilience skills we need to give them. We also need to understand, so when we're putting someone through a resilience program and then evaluating how they're doing the resilience, we also then measure how good is their well-being afterwards? How is their well-being affected by this? But before we can do that, we need to know what their well-being is like beforehand. So we need some really good understanding of what are the issues that officers have before they go into this? How are they experiencing them? So instead of thinking that we know, we need the numbers, the before and after numbers. This is obviously what we psychologists always do, right? Is the before and the after. But we do need this. And I think that we need larger studies to really get a sense of what the issues are so that we connect directly with what the, if you want, the practitioner needs are before we then put our science in to develop the research programs. Now, of course, we have the crisis right now. So science doesn't, practice doesn't wait for science. So we need to do this alongside one another but constantly refine the process over and over again. So those are some of the big questions I have right now. But also, obviously, I'm a positive psychologist. And so my if you want, the context questions that I have is, how does all of this sit within the concepts of psychology? We know from positive psychology that there are different elements that has been shown to support people's wellness. How do people feel on those in their lives? And how can we integrate that into resilience training and really have an impact? And for first responders and police officers, which ones of these are the ones that we need to focus on the most in order to really get the impact from the training that we have? So I have so many questions about where we need to go, but there are people doing research on some of these things already, which is wonderful. But we need to obviously have all of this in place to really have a huge impact.
Thank you. That sounds really exciting, I have to say. Another lifetime of research questions and a field of exploration. Mm-hmm. So our audience today probably is going to be a lot of students who are aspiring to become law enforcement officers. And so what advice would you have for them in terms of developing resilience or seeking out services and resources on the job to help them build that up?
Mm-hmm. And so, this is one of the reasons I got into positive psychology, coming from, as you know, a background of investigative psychology. So I spent, almost 25 years training people to go into some of the toughest jobs out there in terms of law enforcement. These are high burnout, high stress jobs. You're working really big shifts. You don't get sleep. There's all kinds of things happening. And one of the things that became very apparent to me after a while is that when we're sending people out as professors, as teachers, we're training students to go into these jobs. It's also our responsibility to give them what they need to be able to perform well in these jobs. So we're talking now about their professional skills and the personal skills, and that's the resilience. And so my advice for students is to seek out that training when you have the opportunity. Find classes that deal with positive psychology. We've actually, positive psychology, most of the work has been done with students to show that the resilience that we teach people through positive psychology and the awareness of positive psychology actually has a tremendous effect just on being a good student and being resilient during your studies. And we see that students do better if they know about positive psychology and about resilience skills, and better students do better in their studies, and then it sets them up well for whatever careers they're going into. I think that with the new generations of students that we have, obviously there's a different mindset in terms and understanding of mental health. And there's maybe, I'm hoping that there's a less of a stigma now talking about mental health. And I think there's more an awareness of the fact that we do need to focus on our own well-being in order to be able to be well out in the world. And so I think that that's an important conversation to be had. But apart from that, I would just say, you know, it's for students to be aware that to go into these jobs, you need the background and the subject matters to understand the fields better. But I also think that you as people, we're all human beings, and we're going into a situation of adversity, and that could be our job. And is to really prepare ourselves to go into that so that we have everything that we need to do well in those jobs. And the more we're aware of what is available to us, the more we can reach out when we need it later on. And so I think that is some of the things I would say to focus on. There's a lot of positive psychology available, even if there are no classes, online. You can take courses, you can read books. But I think it's about self-care. Self-care, you know, it's like that thing when you go on a flight. This is an example I use with my students in the class. I say, you know, you can't take care of other people if you don't take care of yourself first. And it's like when you go on a flight and they say, put your own oxygen mask on first before you put someone else's oxygen mask on. And as psychologists, we also know this. Even when you're becoming a therapist, you need to make sure that you've had therapy, that you've sort of, you know, have an understanding of yourself before you can help other people. And it's the same thing with law enforcement officers, any kind of job really that we're going into. I would say my biggest advice is take care of yourself, be good to yourself, self-compassion, and, you know, take care of yourself mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. And then you're really building up the core of resilience to do well.
Thank you. Thank you again for being here and taking the time to do this interview. That was certainly very informative, and I learned a lot, and I hope our students will learn from it as well, and take care of themselves and do an all-around good job in that. So once again, this was Gabrielle Salfati with us here today. She's an investigative psychologist, a positive psychologist, a professor at John Jay College, and thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and I wish you all well. And as we say in positive psychology, stay well, stay healthy, and stay resilient. Thank you very much.